Street.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak to the Malaysia Free Trade Agreement Amendment Bill. Mr. Speaker, I got a substantial speech that I've prepared around the detail of the agreement, but I want to pick up a couple of comments that were made by previous speakers on the Hong Kong Closer Economic Partnership Bill, because they're opposite to any free trade agreement. In fact, the Green Party member made a point of referring to a template for free trade agreements and said that the language was the same, the structure was the same, the underlying premises were the same, and therefore the Green Party had the same criticisms of each one of these. In fact, there is a Green Party minority report in the Select Committee report back to the House. There are some good points that Kennedy Graham made in respect of those matters, Mr. Speaker, that I wish to pick up on, because it may be to do with the lateness of the hour, I'm not sure, but in departing from what I'd prepared to say, I do want to commend him for bringing those issues to the House, and similarly the Māori Party member who spoke, Rahui Katani, for reminding us of other issues that impact on our free trade agreements. And life is complex, and we try to pursue our way in the world, achieving the best we can for New Zealand's interests, but not at the expense of others and not at the expense of any of our own. And so there are often issues of conflict and things that people consider to be mutually exclusive propositions, like free trade and human rights, or free trade and indigenous industry. And we in the Labour Party have promoted free trade for a long time, but not at all costs. And so the gradual movement over time to include, for example, labour and environment side clauses, as we see in the Malaysian Free Trade Agreement, are important movements, and they will improve also over time. But I want to acknowledge the concerns about the national interest analysis that Kennedy Graham raised in apropos the Hong Kong Closer Economic Partnership, and relate them to the Malaysian FTA. And I think there is a point to be made about the need for an honest appraisal in the national interest of any negatives to New Zealand. And I, for one, would be keen to see more open processes around our trade negotiations, so that there might be some robust and public consideration, even more robust and public than we have at the moment, which is a process which surrounds this House, and that is the free trade agreement comes to the Select Committee because it needs to be ratified in law, and the public have a chance to speak on it and to contribute to the discussion about it. And yet there are usually only a very few people who are interested and wish to participate. And I wonder, if we made that process broader, whether we would get more input and closer analysis and greater justification and perhaps even more care about Indigenous or New Zealand industries and the impact of free trade agreements on them. And that is all for the future. But it's something that I think we do need to take care of, and I acknowledge the points that the Green Party made in respect of that. But, Mr. Speaker, it still remains that this is a high-quality free trade agreement. And if one compares it with the ASEAN-Australia-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement, it's very clear that it moves further and faster than that agreement. For example, under the Malaysian FTA, this year, at the point of implementation, 95.1% of tariffs on New Zealand exports will be eliminated. Under the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, that's 94.8%, close but not quite as good. And I could track the years of the FTA and compare it with the ASEAN FTA and demonstrate that we go further faster, so that by 2016, 99.5% of New Zealand exports to Malaysia will be tariff-free. All tariffs will be eliminated. And by that time, only 98% of them under the ASEAN FTA will have been eliminated. The remaining 0.5% under the Malaysian FTA are in fact wine and pork products, which have some religious and cultural prohibitions around them. So what do we export to Malaysia that is going to be so generously and helpfully affected? Well, 54% of what we export to Malaysia are dairy products. Another 10% are petroleum products, which is interesting because we import slightly more than that from Malaysia. And in addition to that, we have cereals, minerals and metals, wood, pulp, paper and furniture, meat, fruit and vegetables, and a few other things besides. So how will each of these different sectors be affected? Well, first, let's go to the immediate winner in this. As soon as we get this piece of legislation passed, and it's coincided with the passing of the same legislation in Malaysia, the kiwi fruit industry will experience a huge gain. Currently, there is a 15% tariff on kiwi fruit imports. Despite that, I have to say, New Zealand exports of kiwi fruit to Malaysia have grown by 123% in the last couple of years. But at the moment that this comes into force, the tariff, that 15% tariff, drops to zero. And that means that a lot more earnings are retained in New Zealand. In 2010, other key export products are liberalised in addition to kiwi fruit. And these are butter, cheese, milk powder, honey, wool, apples and some manufactured products. But let's have a look at some of these. Meat, wool, dairy, fish and forestry. We find, in respect of those export industries, the Malaysian Free Trade Agreement confirms the outcome that is also arrived at in the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, and that is an interesting one of binding in existing duty-free access for New Zealand meat, wool, dairy, fish and forestry product exports. And this particular provision means that Malaysia cannot legally change this duty-free level of access for New Zealand exporters, while it can change it for others. And that simply means that our exporters have a greater degree of certainty around their exports. Mr. Speaker, coming from Nelson, where all of those primary products are in abundance, whether we're talking about kiwi fruit or meat or dairy products or fish or forestry, all of those abound, this free trade agreement is going to have a direct and immediate beneficial impact on those New Zealand industries, and I commend it to the House also. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.